Welcome back to Reality Check. This channel cares for hearts and minds. Week in, week out, we have conversations regarding mental health in the areas of marriage, family, parenting, and the workplace. And today is no different. We are going to be talking about one of the most sensitive conversations in our society today, at least as far as marriage is concerned, and that's submission. But before we get into our conversation, just wanted to introduce the people I'm going to be having this chat with. To my left is Dr. Eva Satwine, who you know as a marriage therapist, a parenting coach, a life coach. She's also the founder of International Center for Mental Health and Family Care. And she's joining us today yet again to lend us her insights. And we also have Junior Zerubbabel Kwebiha, who is joining us once again to have this conversation on submission in marriage. And we're really happy to have you back. Thank you for joining us. For the benefit of those of you who are just joining, please don't forget to subscribe. For our old subscribers, we're excited to have you back and welcome aboard. So, Dr. Evas, you're very welcome. I haven't even asked a question. Wow. You're welcome. That's all I was saying. She was already pointing at our guest. Anyway, so submission in marriage, like I said earlier, it's one of the most sensitive conversations in the marriage arena. And I'm just curious as to why this conversation gets people so riled up, tied up in knots. I have a few reasons why I think it is, but I want to hear from you first. Why do people get so agitated by this conversation?
Good. Thank you for having me again. I think for me, submission, people get riled up in it because of what the definition is. I think one of the greatest tricks that has been played is making people believe that submission and obedience are synonyms, which they are not. They are not. So I think for me, over the years, I have learned that is obedience and submission are two different things, two very different things. So that's one of the things. And I think that the lack of education on what the difference is is an expectation of obedience for what should be submission and the reverse. So again, speaking from a man's perspective, again, I've had this with different men. It was something that I thought of myself, asking why is it that people are arguing about it. My wife doesn't kneel down. My wife's not the one who serves me. I don't want the house help cooking for me. All these different things are what we saw submission look like in our parents, in our families. But as we've grown older, that takes different shapes. And just being able to define that submission is a matter of the heart, really. As I've learned, submission is a matter of the heart. It will manifest in different actions, but I have learned that. So I think that there are many people who haven't figured out certain things, and in frustration, submission is a very all-encompassing word. You're not submissive because you don't greet me when I come back from work. You're not submissive because you don't do this with me. You're not submissive because all these different things. So it has now been weaponized, if you may call it that, as the one thing that every marriage, if you put submission in the wife, it's like a drug. If you put submission in the wife, the marriage is going to be fine. And we're not actually dealing with the root of why we are struggling with that. So I think for me, to briefly answer your question, I think submission has been riled up because we're not dealing with the heart of why why wives are not submitting.
I like that. It's been weaponized. I like that. I like the choice of words. Yes, doctor.
I think the reason people are resistant and they hate it, number one is they don't understand it. Yeah. But the second thing is that people have trauma. Yes. Yeah, because I think it's the most misused or abused concepts in marriage. Yeah, there are so many abused concepts in marriage and in this world, but I think submission, you've said it, people use it synonymously with obedience. But I think it's also used, I think some people think it is oppression. Yeah?
Yeah.
And I think both men and women. Because what you're describing as people say, you have to do this, you have to do this. So it's like slavery, and that's why people resent it.
Yes.
Yeah, so those two for now.
So generally there's a misunderstanding of the concept of submission in marriage. And I think, to borrow your words, it being weaponized, some men demanding submission, mostly from a place of ignorance, because they too don't quite understand what it is. And you talk about it being a concept of the heart, and I want for you both to expound on that. What, in your understanding or experience, is submission? Let's start by defining it, and then that will kind of guide us in, our subsequent conversation.
So I think, for me, simply put, submission is someone willingly giving. So I cannot demand submission. Submission is given to me. So I cannot go home and tell my wife, you need to submit to me. The minute you demand it, it is already failed. You already failed. Submission is given. It's given from a place of trust. I trust what you're doing. I trust where you're leading us. I trust the decisions you're making. I trust, so I will submit to you. Even in the Bible, it doesn't tell you to there are some things you submit to, there are some things you obey. So even in this setting, so the simplest way of putting it is, submission for me is my wife saying that she trusts me. That's the simplest way I would put it. And whatever it is that's going to do, it might be a decision. She might come up and say, I would like us to have this. And I will say, I don't agree with you. We're going to go this way. And she'll say, fine, that's okay. That in itself is submission. So there's an element of trust willingly being given by the person that is submitting. So submission is never demanded.
Yeah. Wonderful. So it's an aspect of trust, and it is willingly given. Okay, Doctor.
Well, it is. I was going to say that that submission is embedded in trust. So you can't submit to something or someone you don't trust. And submission is not just in marriage. It's actually submission to leadership. Yeah? And so for me, if you ask for the simplest definition, I would say an act of willingness to accept the leadership of someone. You see?
Yeah.
So two things that have to happen is that there is leadership and that
there's willingness
to accept it.
Yeah. So a lot of our understanding of submission in our world today is drawn from the Bible. And I know that there are people who will find that definition problematic in itself because of what it is trying to portray, for example, in a marriage. So it talks about submission as, like, women submit to your husbands, and then men love your wives like Christ loved the church. And so some people have interpreted it to mean, I submit if I am being loved like Christ loved the church. And we've also talked here that you submit to leadership that you trust. You submit to someone that you trust. What are your thoughts on that, especially if this person is not loving me like Christ loved the church? They're not really leading. I mean, we've had the conversation on men leading and being competent leaders. What then would submission look like in a scenario like that? And a caveat to that question, is my submission always dependent on what my husband is doing or not doing? Yeah.
So drawing from what you've quoted, Ephesians 5:25, when it talks about Jesus loving men loving wives, husbands, not men, husbands loving their wives as Christ loved the church, Christ submitted to the will of the Father. There are times where he cried and said, can this cup of suffering be taken away from me? But let your will be done. He willingly submitted. So while the verse says, husbands, love your wives, there is submission. There is submission. It is not explicitly written, but if you know what Christ went through to love the church, you see a life of submission. You see a life of submission that is expected of the husbands. And the wives also, it is submit. Now, submission and love are not, it's not like a trading desk Yeah, it's a chicken and egg. They are two separate things. They have to be dealt with differently. I like what Doctor said once, that marriage is almost like we grow through certain things. So I cannot only submit after I have been loved. There's an element of growth that I get in submitting to what might be imperfect leadership. But because of where I know God is taking us, there's an element of, even when we are loving our wives as Christ loved the church, we know that that is such a high standard. But we don't give up. You keep trying and going to that way. So I think that wives saying, I'll only submit if I am loved, it is not going to be submission. It's not going to be submission because you are not, it's transactional. So it is not willing. You know, you put a caveat to it before you do it. So I don't believe, I think it's flawed for wives to say, I'll only submit after I am loved. No, it's almost like the key to unlock submission is love. You know, but you can also have a choice where you say, because of how much I love this imperfect person, there is an element of submission that is going to be accorded to them.
Doctor?
No, I agree with him. You see, when we say, I have to submit until he has done this, it's conditional.
Yes.
But then also we have to consider that our checklist, the checklists we come up with, may not be the standard. You see, it's the same thing, men misunderstanding submission and say, I consider submission if you kneel and you do this, if you do. Now, is that authentic? No, that's not. Even women, we can also risk misjudgment of some of these things and say, I've made my own checklist of what it means for this guy to love me. So if you don't buy me flowers, if you don't do this, if you don't pay fees for my brothers, and I mean, like, it's fluid. Yeah. So the thing is, there are certain things that are positional. We are dealing with a position of leadership. And when we talk about submission, we are talking about a structure of leadership in a family. Now, just imagine an organization where there's no leader. Now, when we have leaders, and I think we've had conversations on this show where we have talked about a confident leader. Now, we know that someone who is chosen to be a leader may not be the smartest.
Yes.
Yeah? They may not be the smartest, but they are in a position of leadership. And there are certain things that have to happen. And the concept of leadership is God's way of ensuring stability, is one way of God's way of ensuring order, but also growth and so many other things we want to imagine. Yeah. So leadership is for protection. Now, if there are certain things we do better under the cover of that protection. So if a man is in his position as a leader, it doesn't mean they are going to do everything right. And so you condition your submission to this. No. Think about the workplaces where we are. Some of the people we can actually choose to say, I'm smarter. Yeah? But do you take their leadership position? No. So this is a position of leadership, and it's a structure. So when we talk about submission, we are submitting to an authority that has been established. You see? How that authority looks like varies from family to family. But as we mentioned, I want to emphasize that men and women, we have to be gracious enough to know that until the time we get married, we've been single. When we get into marriage, there are certain things we are going to learn. And I've emphasized that this family management and the whole platform, we learn on the job. Yeah. And so if my husband hasn't learned certain things, I can't say, oh, I'm tagging this submission onto him doing this and this and this. That's why we encourage, please communicate your needs. And also be considerate that this person, you've married a 30-year-old who has done things a certain way. They are now trying to unlearn, to relearn, you know. So you can't tag certain things onto that and say, you have to do this So that, no. In fact, your submission to this leadership can actually inspire the person to be a great leader.
That's true. Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah. And I think there's a genuine worry or concern from women that if they submit to their partners, that they're going to be taken advantage of. I know that for me that was a struggle. And I would want for us to speak to that. How can women, because you talked about willingness to submit to leadership or to trust someone's leadership, how do we get ourselves to that place of willingness to submit? And then how do we address the fear that if I do this, there's a chance I could be taken advantage of? And this usually comes from husbands who are probably ignorant, who also don't understand the concept of submission. So I want for you to speak to both the men and the women in this kind of scenario.
I also think that submission in itself, there are other things. When you're going to plant, you have to put the fertilizer, you have to water. There are other things that have to work hand in hand for this submission to actually be achieved. You have to understand your person. For the entire time I lived with my parents, I never saw my mother kneel down to my dad. But I've got absolutely no shadow of a doubt that she's a submissive wife. And that my father, I can see and I know. Because there are certain things that she learned about how to relate with him. There are certain things that I've seen with my own wife. If she came and knelt down, it won't move me. It won't move me a lot. Okay, you did something which is out of your comfort zone, but it's not going to be ranked up there. But if she came and told me, I trust that, we have a difference of opinion on this matter, but I trust you to lead us to where we are going, that will carry a different weight. So there's an element of also understanding that submission is willing for the person who gives it, but it's unique to the receiver. You understand? So we go and throw submission around as if it's a one-size-fits-all. No, it is not. What submission is to me is not to your husband, is not to your husband. It's going to be very different. So there's work that has to be done in breaking that word down and saying, okay, but what does a submissive wife look like to her husband? And that's why it's very unique. Wives, submit to your own husbands. It doesn't say submit to all husbands.
I know.
So there's an element of understanding the uniqueness of your husband and how submission is interpreted by them as well.
Okay. I like that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, Rachel, the point I made earlier. I hope it doesn't get misleading, where we say submission is embedded in trust, and then people hijack this and say, I don't trust my husband, so I'm not going to submit. Yeah. You see, trust, the biggest part of it is a choice. Yeah, trust is a choice. I can choose to be paranoid, I can choose not to trust this guy, I can say, honestly, the things I'm saying, I can't trust him. But you see, there is a big part of that has to be a personal choice. Yes. And the rest of and I've heard people say, trust is earned. 100%, there is a bit of it that is earned, but there is a trust we give to someone until it is betrayed. You see? So when I connect with you, Junior, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to look at you. I'm going to offer trust. But then you're going to do certain things, and this trust can be enhanced or reduced. Yes. You see? Yes. So there is that trust that has to be there. And so it's not supposed to be conditional. So I don't sit here and say, until I trust this guy, I'm not going to submit to them. No, that's not true. Because and I liked in one of our conversations you mentioned that we marry people out of choice. And in therapy we always ask, how did you end up with this person? There's something you liked about them. Yes. You trusted that you could walk this journey together, and you offered. So you cannot withdraw this entirely and you say, I can only submit if this person does. No. You're growing together. You're growing together. And the kind of, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of trust you put in them, statements like you're mentioning, coming and saying, well, we don't, and I could be wrong as well. You know, that act of humility where you say, well, I'm giving this feedback and think about it. And, well, I see your point. Maybe I don't understand it, but I trust that you probably have given it thought. That allows a ground that facilitates growth and broader thinking. So that's important. But also, secondly, you mentioned that submission could look different. There are certain standard things that have to happen. Because let's go back to our workplaces. How does your leader see that you're submissive to them? Number one, you trust their choices. You trust, not that they make the right wherever. Number two, the way we communicate to people will show that we submit to them or we don't. You know? There is a way I can communicate to you and you say, this person, they're disregarding me. So a wife out there who has a husband and the husband is probably demanding submission, check the way you communicate to them. And I've read that scripture, Ephesians 5, verse 22. It is submit to your own husband. Your own husband. Now, sometimes, by the way, women, we can submit to other people's husbands. Pastors, you're so nice, you talk nicely. When they call you, you just position yourself a certain way, you talk a certain way. Your voice tone communicates respect and trust and all that. But then when you're talking to your partner, it's a different story. You're rude, you're sharp, you're mistrusting and all that. That can show, that can portray submission. Thirdly, decision making. Every leader would like to facilitate decision making. And I'm very careful with my words. I'm not saying make decisions on behalf of everyone else. And I also emphasize the issue of teamwork. So a leader is leading a team, and their wife is part of the team. They are a part of them. They are a helper. We've talked about this. But just imagine in an organization where we have a country director. I've worked in settings where we have an overall organizational CEO, whoever. But then you come and you make certain decisions. I worked in a setting where we would work with donors. Now that was a big thing. There are certain things that you wouldn't do without the knowledge of your leader. For instance, you don't communicate, you don't send communications to donors when the leader is not aware. So there is that importance, that important role of a leader, decision making. It doesn't mean, again, that they sit in a corner, make decisions. And I think that's why some women are resentful, because men have thought that being a leader, I don't have to consult. So you have to submit to everything I say. No. But do you facilitate that decision making and make sure you as a woman, you don't hijack this. Hijack that role. And you're making decisions without the knowledge of your husband. I mean, think about investment things, think about, decisions like even children, the children's schools and all these other things, decisions that have to be, important decisions that have to be made in this enterprise called family. How does this man feel they are in a leadership position? And then you as a wife, you're actually submitting to that structure of leadership.
I mean, Dr. Evers, some people might argue that, in a workplace, there's an element of power. The boss has power over his employees. Therefore, submission is maybe transactional. Because, maybe transactional may not be the word. I have no choice but to submit. Does that make sense? And yet, in a home setting, my husband doesn't have power over me necessarily. He's not the boss of me. Do you get that? In a home setting, there are feelings involved. I've loved this man, I have chosen him. Whereas in a work setting, I don't choose my boss. I find him there, and if I don't submit, I could be fired. The same consequence is not there in a marriage setting. I see the analogy, and I think the principle can be transferred to the home, but there is the aspect of power, where an organization is concerned. And maybe we could talk about what is likely to happen if submission doesn't happen in the right context. And I think you talked about submission being an aspect of position. And then you talked about it being an aspect of the heart. Because you're in that role, because you're in that position as a wife, there are certain things that are expected of you. So what happens if I am out of order? What happens if I choose not to submit? What happens if I am struggling with submission for one reason or the other? What is likely to happen in the home?
I think it's part of what I'm hearing in your question is what happens when submission breaks down? Yes. If you're submitting to leadership and you don't know where leadership is going, it's difficult to submit. How can I trust you when I don't know where we're going? So submission in itself is not what is broken. There are so many other things that are broken. It's just that submission is the straw of grass that a dying man is clutching to. I'm looking for something to argue about, but because I don't know what it is, let me just pick this big word that is very encompassing, So if in the workplace, let's use the workplace as the example you've given. If you don't know the goals of the organization, you can't, even if your boss, we have worked with bosses who are ruthless, but will get the business to where it's going. And people will follow. Like you say, you will work. If you don't want, jump ship. But for the most part, if you're getting your bonus, you're getting your commission, you're getting your salary, most of the time, because you see where they are taking you, you will stay. Are you submitting? It's a choice. Now, in the home, if it's breaking down, part of the reason that it's breaking down is many people don't know. You're not submitting. Why are you not submitting? Okay, you submit, and then what happens? If you can't answer that question, there is no point in fixing submission. Because even if you fix it, you won't know where you're going. So it's there's something that a couple of my friends and I say is life and marriage in particular is a journey. As you're going along, you need to set, not milestones, but like pegs where you agree. You tell your spouse, we agree that this cup is maroon. It's maroon, we agree. We move on from here to the next phase in life. If ahead we get a difference of opinion, we come back to the last point of agreement and say, let's retrace our steps. Where did we get lost? And start retracing our steps. Now, I think part of the issue with submission breaking down is you don't have a family vision. You don't know what you're trying to achieve. I submit to you and you do what with this submission? So there's all the so what that has not been answered yet. So I think for me, if a wife is struggling with that, it is really to first ask, okay, struggling with submission, but if you could figure it out now, if there was a magic wand, if God graciously just said, now you can be submissive, if it worked like that, and you could submit immediately, what would happen tomorrow? Most people will not have an answer to that question.
That's true. Rachel, I'm just going back and even thinking, I'm sure if you asked, like, one of the things I've seen in my work as a therapist, as a marriage therapist, is where we started, that people don't even know what this submission means. Now, I get many husbands complain, my wife is not submissive to me, my wife, and I always ask, please break that down for me. What are you expecting? Now, having said that, of course, if I ask 10 men, probably they would give me 10 different versions of submission. But I liked what he mentioned. You see, in our language, we have a saying that when a father starts introducing themselves to their children, then that's a manifestation of a bigger problem, of a deeper problem. Now, when we start fighting over submission, there's a broken relationship somewhere.
That's true.
You see? Because some of these things, as he said, it's a condition of the heart. If I enter a marriage and I acknowledge my husband's leadership, I know that the head of this home is this person. right? And both of us are behaving in a way that doesn't require that at a certain point we're going to be introducing ourselves to each other. Don't you know I'm the head of this family? Don't you know I'm your husband? Now, every time we start doing those things, we have to know that there is a deeper issue, a deeper problem. Because this relationship, there's a way this relationship is supposed to happen. Now, if you allow me, we can again talk about, you called it a trading table, where people are saying, give me this, I give you this. When you, I think the biggest problem that I've seen is that men love to ask for submission, and they don't care what they are supposed to do. Right?
Yeah.
Now, I was thinking of, if you would like us to use scripture, we've talked about submission in Ephesians 5.
Yes.
But then there is love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. When you read that scripture and you understand how love looks like, right?
Yes.
It is what?
Slow to anger.
Yeah, it is patient, it is kind, it is slow to anger, doesn't keep a record of wrongs. Like, it is too much. In fact, if you ask me, in that scripture in Ephesians 5, it says, love your, I think it is 25, verse 25, which talks about loving your wife as
Christ, yes.
as Christ loved the church. I really feel that men have a higher and bigger responsibility in this scripture than even the women.
Correct.
Because, as we have said, we submit to a leadership.
Yes.
And how is this leadership? A loving leadership. You see, a loving leadership. So this huge responsibility that is put on the man, if men paid attention to that, they probably wouldn't go demanding submission.
There'd be no time.
There'd be no time.
They wouldn't.
Yeah.
And speaking as a psychologist, there is something about the condition of the heart. And I tell people, this heart is the most flexible organ. Just give it the right signal and you're going to get what you want. You know, love it. Let your wife detect that you love them. Let them detect that you, did I use detect? Let them see. Let them see, let them feel that. And again, please note that I'm not saying do this or you do. No. But the men have a higher, bigger responsibility in that portion of scripture than even the women.
Correct.
Right? Yes. Because if I have to position myself in this place where someone has to trust me, right? And I'm not contradicting myself. I said part of the trust is a choice.
Yes.
It's a decision. But then there is a trust in this relationship that someone will say yes. And so there is a lot to do on this side, a lot to do on this side, as well as a lot to do. So we can't just set women up, oh, please, no. And so that's what you are saying. There is something that is happening here.
Yes.
So we cannot just start here. There is a trust to build. There is a security to build. There is a love. There is a kindness. There is all this to do. There's grace that has to be offered.
Yeah.
And then that will happen. But we cannot you can't sit in one direction and say, just submit to me because God said. No, and I hope it's not a contradiction.
No, not at all. So would I be wrong in saying that submission is a result of all these underlying things? So submission is the product
of a relationship.
Of a relationship.
Yes, of a healthy relationship.
Yes.
And a healthy relationship is not a perfect relationship.
Yes.
No,
correct.
It's a relationship where people are growing together. Even when you fall short, you can admit, there is correction, there is repentance, there is all that. You're growing together.
Yeah.
So it is a product of a relationship that you're doing together.
And I think you mentioned it at some point, being a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah.
You know, many times you'll ask someone, what came first? Is it the chicken or the egg? So I think in our relationships, in our marriages, we need to be asking ourselves that question because we are all at different levels. Yeah. Some people got married 3 years ago, others 10, 15, and in those 10, 15 years, you are at different levels in your growth towards submission, towards respect for your spouse, towards you loving your wife like Christ loved the church. And so I think what I'm hearing both of you saying is there's this overarching theme called submission, which is very important for the marriage. what comes first, or what fertilizer or what resources you're putting in to then achieve submission varies from couple to couple, but is very necessary to then create that the submission that we all desire. As we conclude, I want us to, because I mean, women hear this word a lot. And even as we speak, I don't want us to just talk to the women, but there might be a wife out there who is like, you know what, I really want to submit, but the way it has been explained in the different platforms I have been in, whether it's the church or at a wedding or a kwanjula, just leaves a bad taste in my mouth, you know. I understand that there's a value in submission, but for me, in my experience, it has just left me with trauma. So there's a desire to work towards it. What would you say to that woman? What would be a good place to start? And then speak to her husband, who maybe only knows to demand it, and maybe is struggling to understand. I don't understand, because I know maybe it's respect, where men don't know how to define respect. They only know how to define disrespect. So they only understand the lack of respect. Yeah. But when you ask them what is respect, they're like, I don't know. But I know when my wife is being disrespectful. And I think it's the same in submission. I feel like it's the same with submission, that I know when my wife is not being submissive, but maybe I don't know how to explain it. Yeah. I don't even know what my question is there, but I wanted to speak to the men. And women. And the women.
I think that firstly, if we put some guiding principles, I love one of the sayings, take care of the pennies, and the pound will take care of itself. Continuously talking about submission doesn't solve the things that drive submission or the lack thereof. So, you know, as Doctor has said, there are certain things that are lacking in any relationship that then will birth a lack of submission, the lack of trust, the lack of willingness, you know, the brokenness that exists. So for me, if, you know, number one, starting with the men, responsibility. We want to be kings, we want to be leaders, we must take responsibility of the good things and the bad things. If something is broken, find a way, find the help, find the means, lead the family through dealing with what has to be dealt with. That for me is one thing. When, again, going back to the very beginning, when Eve ate the apple, God went to Adam and said, what happened, what have you done? There's an element of responsibility that as men, even in this world where we are dealing with, men don't have places to find help, men don't have all these different things, I can empathize with that. It doesn't take the responsibility away, nor does the responsibility go on the side for everything else to happen. We have to step up and find a way of making it work. So there's no shortcut. That's the first one. The second one is, I like to call it, it's my own saying, the principle of a blank piece of paper. Sit down with your spouse. If you are saying there is no submission, go back to first principles. Let's talk about this. I don't want my marriage to be like this. I don't want to have a relationship where I do not trust you. I don't trust you because the last time I gave you money, you did this. This time you lied to me. The other day I did this. When trust is broken, it has to be rebuilt. There is a price that has to be paid. I think as men, we also have to come to that point of realizing that when something is broken, there is a price that has to be paid to rebuild it. For all the wives out there, and to the husbands, I say that every time you break your wife, only you are going to rebuild her. Only. So the extent to which you want to do the reverse, you start. Yeah? So we have to know that if our wives are broken to a certain point, it's not going to be, the church can help. The church is a tool. Yeah? The church is a tool that we can leverage. But the work is going to have to be done by us. It's not going to be another man. It's not going to be her father. It's not going to be her band of sisters. They will be there to support. But the work of rebuilding the trust that I broke is mine. It doesn't matter how much my wife's father talks to her. If I broke trust, that can never rebuild the trust in me. I have to rebuild it myself. So responsibility, let's go back to the principles. What does submission look like? To you, what does it mean? I learned also that on this year, 18 years, what it looked like in the first year, second year, third year, even I could not clearly define it because I was coming with, this is what I saw my dad do, this is what I saw my mom doing, so I expect the same. So for me, it is go back to the first principles. Where are we going? Why are we in this marriage in the first place? What are we trying to achieve? What do we want to hand down to our children? Okay, if we want to do these things, what are the things we need to do? We take care of those pennies. Submission is going to come on its own. But I cannot overrate or underestimate how much work has to go into men today taking responsibility for where we are. For where we are. Things that are broken, we have to take responsibility for them and start to do the work to begin to rebuild a lot of those things. They cannot be done outside our involvement.
Yeah. Oh, wonderfully said.
I wanted to pull out scripture from Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 16. And I love this version. It says, a country is in for trouble when its ruler is childish. You see? And its leaders party all day long. Wow. And then it goes on to say, woe unto that land when their king is a child. Now, trouble to this family where the head is a child. Right?
Yes.
Now, this is really confusing, because if you say a leader is a child, and there are so many scriptures, there's one in the New Testament which says when a leader is a child, then there has to be advisors around them. So if you asked me, it's going to be very hard for a wife to submit to a childish. And this manifests in so many ways. Can't take decisions, shuts down when communication can. We've seen hides. They can't make hard decisions. They can't come back and say, what's happening to this family? They can't make hard decisions. They cannot have hard conversations. They can't do self-advocacy. They just run. They hide out. And of course, it's sad. Once again, we have acknowledged it on this forum, that on this show, that because men haven't been empowered to handle the basic aspects of life, it affects their leadership. Because a leader who can't have conversation, a leader who is intimidated, a leader, so what is going to happen? Now, lastly, Rachel, I think it's also very hard, and I will say this to men, it's very, very, very hard when your wife perceives you as horribly insecure. It's very hard to submit to an insecure husband. You know? Because if they are worried about you earning, they are looking at you and they just leave. And I've met many men. They talk and you sense, you have certain heart issues to deal with. This has nothing to do with your wife. So if you want to position, because this position is there to be filled. And if you can feel it and your wife feels this cover, not because you're perfect, but you're in your position as a head over family, then it's going to be easy. You're not even going to have conversations. You're not going to introduce yourself to your, don't you know I'm your husband, I'm the man in this home, submit to me.
As a woman, plug into the spaces where you are hearing. I think we don't get tired of learning. The more you talk about it, the more you engage with this conversation, the more you will pick aspects and principles that will work for you in your home. I think what overwhelms us is the church is talking about submission. I'm hearing it at traditional functions. I'm hearing it at weddings. And it just all sounds very lopsided, or women do this, while the men are being told they are babies. And so that kind of feels unfair. So thank you very much for joining us this week for this conversation. Again, would love to hear your thoughts. Stay well, stay healthy. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.